All right, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Suzanne Basie. I'm the Associate Director with the Illinois Society of Professional Engineers. Welcome to our February First Friday webinar. As you know, our First Friday webinar series takes place the first Friday of each month from 12 p.m. to 1 p.m. Central Time. We offer these webinars as a free member benefit for ISP members, and non-members are able to participate for the low cost of $20. If you regularly come to our First Friday webinars and are not a member, you could view a state and local membership as a subscription. At this point in time, membership is $150, but we are offering a 6-month free promotion right now. So if you can join online and get your first 6 months free and enjoy the First Friday webinars free for the next 6 months. Just a few reminders as we go to enter into the webinars that the link to the quiz was sent in the registration email, as well as the PDF handouts that were made available by our paneling and presenting team. That's the same link that we use every month, so bookmark it if you'd like. It is not something that you can find linked from the website. So through the email link, your quiz link is there, as well as the downloadable view of the handouts. We ask that everyone please try to take the quiz by 8 o'clock on Monday morning. We know that sometimes your schedule doesn't allow for that. We typically grade the quizzes sometime during the week and hope to get the certificates out to you within the next 2 weeks. It does take a little bit of time if those if we have a couple that don't pass, we follow up with them before we issue the certificates. To ask questions during the webinar, feel free to use the questions window that is available on the GoToWebinar toolbar. You'll see it when you're logged in. You may need to maximize the toolbar on your computer to be able to see the question panel. I will be moderating the session, and we'll ask the questions toward the end of our program. So we can get started. We are pleased to have the team from Hub International to talk with us today about cybersecurity and what we need to know as design professionals and business leaders. I am going to turn things over to Matt Gilmore, who is the Risk Services Leader from Central and North Region, as well as the Risk Services Lead for the National Financial Institutions Practice. Matt?
Thank you, Suzanne, and hope everybody's doing well today, and thanks for coming to today's webinar. Just want to do a quick introduction to Hub International. We're a top 10 insurance broker based out of Chicago, Illinois, with over 11,000 employees globally and focusing primarily in the United States, Canada, and Puerto Rico. And some of the presenters today represent our brokerage team that are primarily involved in the sales and servicing of the cyber policies, but we are focusing primarily on the prevention and mitigation of these types of breaches. And so I'll introduce our other speaker, who's part of my team on the risk services team. So we're an insurance brokerage primarily, but we are staffed very well with risk consultants that have a wide depth of expertise, and that is primarily our role, is to offer superior solutions, risk management solutions to our clients. Not only the small employers, middle market, but also our larger employers too. So just a quick introduction, and I hope everybody can see the slides okay, but just want to introduce Emily Selck real quick. She is our Vice President and Cyber Liability Practice Leader out of Chicago, and her role is primarily to assure that policies are placed within a region for our most critical clients, as well as consult them on different resources such as the carrier relationship when you have a policy and how they respond. John Farley is my colleague in the risk services team. He's based out of New York and is our cyber practice leader. John and Emily both are regular speakers on this topic, as well as working through client issues every day. I think, John, you handle what, 3 or 5 breaches almost in a week's period. Is that a pretty fair statement?
Yeah, fair to say. I was directly involved in 73 data breaches last year, and in January this year, 8 breaches. So it's about twice a week now. Yeah.
Yeah. So quite prolific, and what we'll make a couple points today working through our agenda and everything. But yeah, John, I'll just take this one. So what we want to do is just kind of make sure that you all had a good indication of why cyber breaches are so risky to not only our larger clients, but even our middle to small clients. And we wanted to bring you up to speed on how you can be exploited in some threats that happen from not only internal resources, but external as well. It's not just Russia, it's other people too. And we want to give you some solutions around this topic and show how you can better prepare yourself. And of course, we really, not to be a sales pitch today, but we want you to understand why cyber policies are important and why they aren't the cure-all. So there are definitely some internal controls necessary as well as good coverage, and Emily will mop that up with her explanation of that. So please stay tuned, ask questions when the proper time comes, and I hope you really enjoy this. John, go ahead.
All right. Well, thank you, Matt. Thank you, everybody, for taking the time out today to attend our seminar. So why don't we just dive right into it. Matt, if you don't mind flipping to the next slide, and I'll take this section of the presentation. So what we have up here is HUB's definition of cyber risk management. Because if you ask people, what is cyber risk or cyber risk management, you might get a lot of different answers. But given our experience, we've kind of come up with a definition which really speaks to a multi-layered approach. So as you see in our graph on the right there in the gray, and at its core, we have cybersecurity, which is really, the technology defenses that we've been known or been accustomed to. 20 years ago, cybersecurity was really put in the back rooms of the IT department, right? That's where it stayed. That's where the risk was managed. And really the CEOs kind of devoted some resources to that back room and left it there. But unfortunately, over time, the hackers have evolved in such a way where they're not just attacking that back room, they're attacking employees. They're attacking every one of us. And what we're seeing is that they're becoming quite successful. And over these years, we've seen them get through. And so what we've done now is we've come to the realization that, it's going to happen, right? We've all heard about it in the news almost on a daily basis. So we've expanded out to our next layer of cyber response. So it's really up to every business to get ready for the event and get ready to respond. So if the hack happens, who are you going to call? How are you going to handle it? What decisions are you going to make? And who's going to make those decisions? Really critical in kind of mitigating both the financial and reputational harm to an organization. So we'll talk more about that as we get into the presentation. And in the darker blue, as we expand out, we see this cyber risk transfer layer here, and that's either transferring the risk through contracts or through insurance. So there's ways to do that, and we'll talk about that. And then as we expand out, we need to gather cyber intelligence, figuring out how the bad guys get in, what we're expected to do if we are breached, what the privacy laws say, kind of gathering all that and applying it to our everyday business. And you're kind of doing that today by attending this webinar. And then finally, bringing the lessons back to your organization and bringing them to every single employee to educate. It doesn't matter who they are. If they're using a network or they're using a laptop or a smartphone, they are at risk and they need to be educated. So we expanded out that far. Next slide, Matt. All right, so we pulled a chart from an annual data breach study, and this is done by Net Diligence, and this is their most recent study. And we wanted to sort of analyze, who is being attacked here. And as you can see, the majority of companies that are attacked are smaller companies. These are companies that make less than $50 million in annual revenue. So this really bunks the myth that, the hackers are only after the big banks or the big retailers like Target and Home Depot. The fact of the matter is almost half the time they're going after the small companies. And when you think about it, if I'm a hacker, I want to go after that small company, because if it's a mom and pop that's taking credit cards and I want to steal credit cards, chances are that mom and pop is not going to have the cyber defenses that the larger retailers might have or the multinational bank might have. So that credit card that I steal, whether it's from a big bank or from a small mom and pop, is going to get me the same amount on the black market when I go to sell it. So when you get inside the hacker's head and then you look at this chart, it kind of makes a whole lot of sense. So The reason we want to emphasize this is that we often get that pushback from our clients saying it's not going to be me, it's the bigger guy, it's the name brand, when in fact the opposite is true. Next slide, Matt.
And John, if I can make a quick comment too, is I know we talk a lot about financial data, but with the audience here too, there's things like intellectual property that you may have, such as key storage files like your prints, things that you scanned, their client material, things like that. So don't just think of this as just financial terms. There's also the intellectual property as well. So sorry, John.
It's a great point, Matt. It's a great point. We're seeing a lot of foreign nations stealing our intellectual property, creating products on the cheap because they didn't have to do the work of sort of inventing the product, if you will. So they basically create the same product on the cheap and compete against that very company that they just hacked. So we're seeing China, not to point at China the whole time, but they have been very offensive in that regard, and we know it. The government knows it, and so we'll see how that's going to be dealt with in the future. But beware of your intellectual property; they're after it. All right. So the next slide up here is the per record cost. Okay, and when we say per record cost, and by the way, this was a study pulled from the Panama Institute. They do an annual data breach study as well. And really what this per record cost study is the per identity or per credit card that are compromised in a breach. So if you have 100 records compromised, they've given a dollar amount to each record, and they've estimated what it's going to cost you. So, for example, if you're in the healthcare sector, and they broke it down, as you can see, by industry here. So if you have 100 records compromised and you're in the healthcare sector, chances are it's going to cost you as the breached company $380 times 100. As we know, a lot of these breaches involve several thousand, sometimes millions of records. And as you can see, no matter where you are on this chart, it's going to cost you a lot of money if you have thousands of records compromised. Whether it's $71 a record or $380, it's a costly event. And one point I want to make here about why the numbers might be different by industry is that certain sectors are heavily regulated. So, for example, in healthcare, you have HIPAA, right? So, and not only do you have a breach and you're dealing with all kinds of issues there, but you may have a regulator that is going to fine you or penalize you because you were breached and you allegedly didn't secure the data. So you have these legal obligations and fines and penalties, and that can drive up your number. Next slide, Matt. All right, and then from the Panama study, they broke down the types of attacks and then broke down the cost by type. So as you can see here, and as you might expect, when you have a malicious attack, a deliberate attack by a criminal, it's $156 per compromised record. And 47% of the time, that's the case. It's a direct, deliberate attack by a criminal. But of course, there are other ways they happen. System glitches and human error really wasn't an intended breach, but it happened, and personal information was disclosed, and you have a cost to it. So as you can see, no cause is cheap here. Slide, Matt. So we tried to break it down to simplify this in ways to understand how these incidents occur. And essentially, there really are 4 different ways that they occur. And I'm going to start on the upper left here, which is the internal accidental, right? So this is the case where an employee simply makes a mistake. This has nothing to do with a hacker. It's just somebody that happened to lose a laptop. And it turns out that that laptop was not encrypted, not properly protected, and it contains sensitive information that may or may not have been disclosed, but we have no way of knowing where that laptop went, who may have accessed it, who didn't, and you have a data breach. So you have legal obligations when that occurs. So it's purely an accident. And other ways the accidents occur, it could be just an email that was sent to the wrong party with the wrong attachment that contains sensitive information about people, their social security numbers, banking information, and it gets disclosed that way. It's, again, a simple mistake, not a hack, but it leads to those costs. As we move to the right, we have the intentional internal, which would be your classic disgruntled employee. And let me tell you, this is probably one of the most difficult hacks to prevent, because oftentimes this happens from an employee that has access to your network, right? It could be an IT person that's gone rogue, right? They have the keys to the kingdom. They've been given the access, yet they do bad things with that access. They take advantage and they take data, they sell it on the dark web, or they're just unhappy with management and disclose things. You could also have data entry clerks or some admin assistants to high-ranking officials who have access. So these people go rogue sometimes, and they can do an awful lot of damage. On the bottom left, we have the accidental external, and this would be your vendors. So many times you may take sensitive information in. So take the example of your employees. You have all of their information, their social security numbers, banking information for payroll, and then you turn it over to a payroll company, right? And a payroll company is handling that function for you. The payroll company gets breached, and now you have some explaining to do. You have to tell the affected individual that, hey, there was a hack of your information, and there was this payroll company. Equifax was a good example of that. A lot of companies used Equifax, and half of America was compromised because there was a hack at Equifax. You and I may have never engaged with Equifax, but our employers may have used them, or some other party may have used them. When you bought a car, someone did a credit check on you. That's a classic example of a vendor being breached. And really, the person you gave the information to really is not at fault, but technically they have a legal obligation to notify you when they have issues. So that's a vendor breach. And in some sectors, 1 in 4 data breaches occur at the vendor level. So be aware this is a very big problem. And then to finally go to the bottom right, we have the intentional external, which are hackers. We're going to talk an awful lot about hackers. But one thing I want to emphasize here, and Matt alluded to it earlier, sometimes, they're after credit cards, right? They're after identities, and they're after identity theft. And granted, that's probably the leading motivator for hackers. That's kind of always been the case. But we've seen hackers evolve over time in a very significant way, and they're often motivated by other things. Now, Matt mentioned intellectual property, right? And that's something they may be after. But there's also politics that sometimes motivate hackers, right? We've all heard about the group called Anonymous, and Anonymous is a loose band of hackers who are not after financial gain, but they have a twisted philosophy that basically says, you know what, we believe all information should be exposed and free to everyone, regardless of what it is. So they go after companies that they believe are secretive, and they go after governments who they believe are secretive, and they go to expose that information. So they're driven by really a philosophy, not so much financial gain. So, and then finally the nation states too. The politics get involved in a very grand scale. We've seen North Korea, Russia, China, Iran. There's a number of countries out there that are carrying out some form of cyber war. And that's of grave concern because we're worried about critical infrastructure, right? Credit cards are one thing, but when they take out the lights, the power grid, that's another whole other problem. So that will affect a huge geography. So we're kind of worried, we're very worried, I should say, about cyber warfare and the concept of it being carried out against our critical infrastructure.
Hey, John, can I kind of bring before we go on, if I could just bring in the group a little bit. So we've covered a lot of material so far, and I guess I'd like to make it kind of close to home. We talked to you about some of the smaller organizations being affected, and I think many of the people on this call would consider themselves, smaller to mid-level businesses that don't have an IT department and things like that. So I was wondering if you could just spend a minute and talk about the Target situation that, famous now a few years, to talk about the relationship with its vendors and what really happened there, and maybe we could position that in a way that our audience could really be more sensitive to.
Yeah, absolutely. That was some breach. Let me tell you, for a lot of reasons. It really, first of all, that breach really put the whole issue on the map, and it really hit home for a lot of people because 40 million credit cards were compromised, including my own. And this happened back in 2013. And for those that are not aware of the facts around that breach, it's really interesting how that happened. It happened through a vendor. So I mentioned all about how vendors can be breached and it's your problem. Well, this was a situation where Target had outsourced HVAC work to a company called Fazio Mechanical. Okay, and this is a relatively small HVAC firm out of Pennsylvania. And they had a billing system that connected to Target's network. And that's how they billed Target for their HVAC work. Well, through a phishing email, an attack against Fazio, someone at Fazio clicked on a phishing email. Hackers got into Fazio's network and were able to hop over to Target's network during the holiday season of 2013. They laid there undetected and collected 40 million credit cards. And that's how that breach happened. So it was a vendor issue. And again, the target here was a small HVAC contractor, not target directly. So it was, that just brings home the point that they're after small companies, they're after vendors, and that's how one of the biggest breaches that we've heard of happened. So.
And just one more point on that too is that, and everybody thinks of cyber insurance being able to protect you. Well, think of the reputational risk now that Fazio has. Now, if you go on their website, I don't know if it's still up, but about a year ago, they actually had a whole section of their website dedicated to what they've done to protect their clients now for cyber risk. And this is just a small HVAC company that didn't have the protections in place and never would have thought that this would have happened to them. And it pretty much devastated their business. So again, not to be alarmist, but we do want to let you guys know that the threat is real for our smaller and mid-level clients.
Yeah, and the last number I saw when Target reveals their numbers every quarter, they come out with their expenses, and I saw 300 million or close to it, 300 million in data breach costs related to that event. So these numbers are absolutely real. All right, so now we want to kind of shift over, man, if you don't mind. We're going to go into the way the hackers get in, and I want to talk a little bit about the hacking process itself. I look at hackers in very much the same way as I look at the traditional home burglar. So the traditional burglar would sit outside your house, kind of take an inventory of who's coming in, who's home, who's not home, when they're home, what windows are open, what doors are open, that kind of thing. And they might sit out there for a couple of days. Hackers do the same thing, except they do it online and they do it and they're invisible. Really, nobody can really tell that there's somebody out there lurking. Whereas, the traditional burglar, you might have had a good neighbor, or you might have had somebody notice something suspicious and call the police. Well, unfortunately, online, we don't have that luxury. So hackers have all the time in the world to do their reconnaissance and to do their scanning of networks to see what ports are open and how they can get in. And once they're in, they'll exploit different databases within the organization. They're going to move around. They're going to try to access the privileges of the largest or higher ranking people. So the director of IT they'll go after, because if they can get his credentials, they can then get the access to any database they want. They're going to move around the system and find the most valuable data they can and extract that data and sell it on the dark web, commit identity theft. And finally, they're very good at covering their tracks. I saw a recent study where in the retail sector, it takes on average 6 months until somebody realizes that a breach has occurred. So a hacker is in the system for 6 months, exfiltrate all the data, and they're gone. And then, you realize it 6 months later. So by that time, the damage is done, and you're not going to get that data back. Next slide, Matt. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the idea of having physical access to your premises, because a lot of times when we envision cyber risk, we think about hackers from Russia, China, or somebody in their basement far away. But the fact of the matter is data breaches occur when people have physical access to your office or to your company, and they simply physically steal laptops and devices. They sometimes use USB-like devices. They look like USB drives, but they can simply insert them into your computer and in 30 seconds steal all kinds of information, including passwords. These things are configured in such a way that that's all it takes. As long as they have physical access, insert the USB drive into your computer, they can make off with everything on that laptop. There are other ways they do it. Badge cloning is another way to get into your premises. So we all have badges and we swipe them and the door opens and we get in. Many times, hackers will be standing physically close to you, and they have devices that can copy that code from inside your pocket and create a badge that replicates yours. And they become you, and they can access your premises. So there are ways that they can physically get in like that. And then also outside your premises, you may have a dumpster, and you may have paper files that are disposed of, and they are not properly shredded. Well, hackers have taken to the low-tech way of stealing data by simply diving in the dumpster, right? They take the papers out of the dumpster, they have the information, and that's a data breach. A low-tech way, but it has been done. And then finally, Wi-Fi hacking. So there are unsecured Wi-Fi networks that people go on, and as long as hackers are close enough, typically within 20 or 30 feet, there are hacking devices that can intercept communications from unsecured Wi-Fi networks, and that's how they steal data as well. So again, these are ways that they hack with physical access. They don't necessarily aren't far away, but they can do it that way. Next slide, Matt. All right, so social engineering, I'm sure you've all heard the term, but social engineering is basically a hacker's way of taking advantage of our natural tendencies to trust other people. So they impersonate people. We see them impersonating CEOs and CFOs all the time, and they do it many different ways. Most common is phishing emails. So many times they'll go into a network, they'll take over the email inbox of a CEO or CFO, and they'll send an email to the director of HR. And they'll say, Director of HR, please send me everybody's W-2 form. And the director of HR, thinking it's the CEO, will immediately send everybody's W-2 form. And now there's a situation where the hacker has the W-2 forms, they file fraudulent tax returns, steal the money, steal the returns, and they take the data elements that they stole from the W-2 and commit further identity theft. So this is a very common event, especially now during tax season. So be aware of those kind of phishing emails where someone's asking for sensitive information. They often ask for funds as well. There's often a request for funds transfer. So they'll target the accounting department and say, Mr. Head of Accounting, could you please transfer $1 million to our new bank in China? And the director of accounting says, sure, and he does it without question. So we see funds transferred all the time this way through email phishing. But there are other ways they do it. Websites that are basically altered, and you go on that website, and now they infect your network with malware. They get to you through text, just like they do emails, and also vishing with a V. This would be a voice, a phone call, a fraudulent call, pretending to be somebody that they're not, asking for information, and people giving it up. Next slide, Matt. Also wanted to mention remote exploits. So when hackers are not nearby, they're on another corner of the world. But what they do is they take programs that you can get online now for free and basically scan IP addresses for what we call known vulnerabilities. And there are tens of thousands of known vulnerabilities out there. And so what these programs do is they'll take the IP address, scan it with thousands of known vulnerabilities, and see whether or not that particular IP address has patched that vulnerability. If not, they'll exploit it and they'll get in that way. And it really doesn't take a whole lot of technical expertise. I mean, it's sort of a pre-built thing, and you simply apply it to an IP address and see what you can get. So you can find these many times for free online. They're out there, and again, it doesn't take a lot of skill, but they'll do that scanning, that exploiting that we talked about earlier, and exfiltrate the data that way. Next slide, Matt. Now that we've talked a lot about the threat, right, and how it happens and what it costs, we've identified a number of ways that any company can either prevent the breach from happening or to mitigate both the financial and reputational harm, should it occur. So this is a chart that also came from the Panama study, and they studied the things that companies did that either drove up the cost per compromised record or drove it down. So as you can see on the top here in the red, these are things that companies did that drove up the cost, that actually made the problem worse. So when you have a third party involved or a vendor, right, we talked about that, the vendor's breached with your data, that drives up the cost by $16.90 per compromised record. So that's a situation where the client had no control and have no control of the investigation. They really are relying on the vendor to do the job of investigating the breach and communicating, and oftentimes that doesn't happen. So that can hurt them. I won't go through all of these for the sake of time today, but I do want to kind of point down towards the blue section here, where we have things that companies can do to really help save them bottom line dollars. The most important thing they can do is put together an incident response team, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But here it shows that having an incident response team in place, being prepared before the breach occurs, that saved companies $19.30 per compromised record. And again, these numbers can really add up if you have thousands of records that are compromised. Next slide, Matt. All right, so we've identified 10 things, the top 10 things that any organization can implement to either prevent a breach or to mitigate the financial and reputational harm. And I'm going to go into each one of these in detail. So, Matt, you can actually flip to the next screen. So, enterprise risk management. This is traditional risk management, right? So, a risk manager of an organization typically looks at every which way they can be harmed, either reputationally or financially. And there's a long list of concerns that they've had for many years, and they've many times developed sophisticated ways to deal with each one of these. But my point about this slide is that I really believe that cyber risk management ought to be at the top of this list, because if you look at the things that they're concerned about, things like loss of senior leadership, right? Insurance failure, reputational harm, regulatory risk. There's a lot of things on here that can all be triggered all at once in the immediate aftermath of a cyber attack. So we talked about Target before. Right after that breach occurred, in a matter of weeks, the CEO was relieved of his duties. He was thrown out. So was the CIO, by the way. So you lose senior leadership. You have reputational harm. You might have regulatory harm, where you have a regulator now or attorney general who will sue you because you didn't secure the data. And it goes on and on. IT disaster. You'll see on this list, there's a ton of things here that can be triggered all at once. And if that's the case, cyber risk management has to be at the top.
And John, I know you kind of mentioned Target a couple of times, but wouldn't it be fair to say that Target itself had been pretty responsible as far as their budget for cyber protection, the roles and responsibilities? I mean, overall?
Yeah. In fact, they were PCI compliant, which is what you're supposed to be if you're a retailer. They actually were PCI compliant. It just was one of those situations where they got in through a back door. And at the end of the day, that didn't matter a whole lot. I mean, it did, 40 million credit cards are 40 million credit cards. And now those credit cards had to be replaced. There was a lot of fraud. There were lawsuits, class actions, you name it. So that you can get overwhelmed pretty quickly. Even if you are, if you think you're actually practicing, best practices, if you will. All right. So business continuity, right? A lot of organizations might have a business continuity plan, but they don't plan for a data breach. So here we actually wanted to highlight the fact that, maybe it's not records being stolen, but it could be downtime due to a cyber attack. So there are things called denial of service attacks. So basically hackers will flood your server with lots of requests, and they do this by infecting thousands of other computers and sort of pointing them towards your server and forcing them to communicate to one server, and it will thereby crash your server. So denial of service attacks are a big problem. And as you can see here, the average downtime when a sender goes down is 95 minutes. And time is money here. I mean, the average loss to business is $740,000, and it creeps up to almost $1 million when you have a denial of service attack. So this is the fastest growing cause of outages, and we believe that a business continuity plan, having it in place before the breach occurs, is going to help you decrease the likelihood. And if it does occur, it's going to save you money in the end. So have that. Your business continuity plan has to anticipate cyber attacks and downtime and ways to sort of get back up quickly. So cyber risk assessments is another way of sort of preparing and preventing a breach, preventing the incident from happening in the first place. So as we see here, 26% of businesses will face a breach involving 10,000 records every 2 years. That's the studies. So we know it's real. We know it can happen. So what do? We do what we call cyber risk assessments. And this is basically an overview of your entire system. And this is not only your technology, but your people, your processes, your training, your compliance, and evaluating where your vulnerabilities may lie. You want to have an idea of what your financial costs might be if you go down or if you're hacked. You want to gather intelligence and do what you can to shore up those vulnerabilities. You can do it a number of ways. There are penetration test firms. So these are what we call ethical hackers. Believe it or not, it's a real title. Ethical hackers will actually be hired by companies to go in and try to hack their network to see if there truly is a vulnerability. And if they get in, that ethical hacker will tell them how they did it and recommend ways to remediate that vulnerability. So that's something that we recommend quite often, and we think it's important to do probably at least once a year, because hackers have ways of getting around systems. So you might have an airtight system today, but tomorrow the hacker will figure out a way around it. So it's something that shouldn't just be done once, it should be done on at least an annual basis. Next one, Matt. All right, so then also along those same lines, your activity, right? So how are you storing files? Do you have physical protection around your devices? The assessment should go on to your online activity and your mobile device procedures. Do you have a BYOD program, a bring your own device program, right? And what does it say about, lost devices or people that leave the firm that had access to sensitive information through their smartphone? What procedures do you have in place there? What procedures on email? We talked about, social engineering, right? So anytime funds are requested to be transferred over a certain dollar amount, there should be a process in place. Social media usage, right? A lot of times we see people on their companies on their Facebook account or their LinkedIn account announcing lots of things, including hierarchy, right? Who reports to who? Well, that can set up a social engineering attack, because now as a hacker, I know that Mary Jones is the CEO and the director of HR, John Smith, reports to Mary. Well, now I know who's who, and I'm going to start my impersonation. So be careful what you put out there on social media. And then finally, travel. Be wary of the countries you travel to. So if you're traveling to China, Russia, well, your chances of being hacked there are greater than other countries. So understand the environment that you're in. Next slide, Matt. So IT security policies, I'm not going to bore everybody with what should be in your IT security policy, but I did bullet point some of the things that should be in there. And there are things that you would expect, right? Procedures for data governance, data security, and ways to managing the risk. Compliance if you're subject to industry standards, and how you're maintaining it, right? How are you evolving? If you make a new acquisition, now you've inherited that IT system, how are you maintaining this? One thing I want to emphasize about your IT security policies is that you may say a lot of wonderful things in that IT security policy about how you're protecting your client's data. Just make sure that you practice what you preach, because if in reality you're not doing what you're saying in that IT security policy and you have a breach, and it's a big enough breach that it got the attention of a regulator, we've seen the Federal Trade Commission come in and go after companies and say, hey, here's your IT security policy, Exhibit A in a court of law. This is what it says, but in reality, this is what you did, and you didn't comply to it. So that's an unfair trade practice. We get into all those kind of things. So just again, be wary that whatever you put in writing, that you're practicing it. It's very important. Next slide. So we talked about cyber incident response plans being the leading thing anybody can do to mitigate financial harm, right? So what's in an incident response plan? What we tried to do was outline the roles and responsibilities of different folks that will participate in the incident response plan and what departments it might come from. So as you can see, there's really across disciplines that are going to apply to the plan. So you might have folks in the IT department that will be charged with identifying the problem, right? So they've identified a hack. Now they have to know how to escalate it, when to escalate it, and who to talk to. So then you get into, senior management, right? Who's going to manage the investigation, document what happened, preserve evidence, right? Because this is going to be very important to determine what happened, what information was compromised, what information was not compromised, who's going to assist with law enforcement, right? And who's going to be the one talking to regulators if they come knocking, right? So again, you can see there are going to be people from IT, from compliance, from legal, possibly, even customer service if it's big enough. You might have a media inquiry. So how are you going to deal with the media? So all these things will go into your incident response plan with the goal of mitigating harm. Next slide, then. So then once you have the plan together, the best thing to do is practice it, because if you put a plan together and you don't touch it for 2-3 years and then you have a data breach, chances are people are going to forget what their roles are, and you won't be able to execute that plan very well. So we recommend that at least once a year that you simulate a cyber attack and have the folks that are in the plan sort of start making decisions, right? You want to test whether or not they know what their roles are and what decisions they're going to make sure, that, again, that you're carrying out the plan and you're preserving the company's reputation and bottom line. Next slide, Matt. So again, we talked about vendors before. 25% happen at the vendor level. So if you have a vendor, what we do is, first thing is we look at your contract. You know, what does it say about data breaches? Does it even address data breach response? If the vendor has a breach, you want to know about it as soon as possible. You want to have indemnification language where, hey, if it's their fault and you incur costs, well, they should be reimbursing you for those costs. So you want to have contractual clauses there, and you want to make sure that the vendors are doing everything that you're doing to protect data, right? So are they doing penetration tests? Are they maintaining, you know, security policies? Are they doing background checks on their employees, right? So lots of questions for your vendor to make sure that they've got your data secured.
Hey, John, I got a question real quick. So a lot of the folks on the call today are probably vendors to some of these organizations. A couple points here is, if they're asked to, you know, they may be asked or have been asked before to provide some of this information. So, you know, obviously you need to be prepared for that. But I see this as a marketing potential for you all on the call, because, you know, you can tell your clients that, hey, we understand our risk. You know, we're a better person to work with, company to work for. We understand how to protect your data as well as our own, and we've taken the steps to mitigate this, where our competition doesn't really understand this, and they're a greater risk. I know it's not the A1 issue that helps you get your bids and the work that you do, but it's just one more thing to consider as you become more sophisticated in your cyber risk control.
Right. That's just another feather in your hat. I mean, really, it's one of those things where, you know, you're doing a lot of things for a client, and you also have to, just basically you're telling them, look, I'm doing pen testing. I have insurance. I have all these controls in place. I train my employees to look out for spear phishing. So these are questions that you may be asked if you haven't been asked already, and just be prepared, to answer that, because if you can't answer those questions, and your competitor can, again, as Matt says, it is a competitive leg up if you can do that. So be aware of that. So training, again, talked a lot about that, but really this is all about bringing training to your everyday employees who are going to be at some point they're going to deal with a phishing email, or they're going to deal with some kind of a scam that can lead to a data breach. So it's all about having policies in place and training on those policies, making sure they're aware of what your policies are for data governance. All right. So are they able to download software on their own? Are there any controls in place to make sure they can't do that? Sometimes that is allowed, and then that's just another way of opening a door for a hacker. So just understanding how they're getting and navigating around the network, what devices they're using, if they're using their own. Is there a way for you to scrub data if it's lost or if they leave the firm? All kinds of issues to train them on. Passwords, right? And creating them as long as you can with multi-symbols and upper and lowercase letters and all that. You should have a password protection plan in place, and also a means to report an incident. A lot of times an employee may see something, but they don't even know where to report it. So there should be some form of reporting capability. And another thing I would say about training is we're seeing a lot of companies come out with spear phishing training. So they'll do cyber risk training and do a presentation like this, and then a month later simulate an attack, a spear phishing attack, and send out emails to people to see who clicks on the link. So this way, a company can identify, who their problem employees are and who the all-stars are, right? Because you want to make sure that they're reporting it. So who reported it to IT and who clicked on the link, right? So that's another way to gauge how well your staff is really understanding cyber risk management. And then finally, my last slide here is insurance, and I don't want to steal Emily's thunder because she's going to go into this and then the final portion of our presentation today. But one thing I just want to say is that there is no such thing as a standard cyber insurance policy. There are I think over 80 different cyber insurance policies out there They're all written on their own manuscript form. So Emily's going to walk us through the different coverages. I have them listed here, but she's going to go into more details to that. And again, it's a great way to transfer your risk if in fact the hackers do get in. So I don't want to talk too much about this, and I know we're kind of short on time. So I'm going to flip it over to Emily to go into more detail here.
Thanks a lot, John. Emily, go ahead.
Thanks, guys. So, just to kind of talk through the insurance policy really quickly, I've got some slides here that have quite a bit of information on them, but I'll summarize the best that I can. But what's really important to know about a comprehensive cyber policy is that it's really modular in form. We're able to adapt the policy to your operations, to a particular exposure that you have that would make sense to include it on the policy. So there's a number of different ways that we're able to take a look at your risk and tailor-make an insurance policy that fits with that. So this first slide really kind of gives you an indication of that. So there's information about a few different coverage parts that are included in there that you potentially put on your cyber policy that may or may not be relevant to you. The technology, and miscellaneous professional liability are two that we see the most frequently thrown onto a cyber policy. And those are really coverages for your professional liability risk. Anything that you have contracted with someone else to provide a service for, if there's a failure for that service and there's a financial loss, then there's coverage under the policy. The media liability is also something that's important because if you have a website, if you have marketing materials, if you have any sort of brochures that you hand out, then there's coverage under the policy for anything that anyone could allege from that, whether it's you've used their likeness without permission or you've utilized something where they feel like they've had some sort of financial harm. So we can go on to the next slide. So this next one gives you an idea of the third-party liability coverages that we find on a traditional cyber policy. And what this is really coverage for is the event that a third party comes after you and says that you had some sort of breach of their information and they had a financial loss because of it. Or there's regulatory bodies or the PCI comes after you and says you've had some sort of breach and you weren't in compliance. So the first two are the security and privacy liability. They really go hand in hand. If someone alleges that you didn't keep information secure, you didn't keep information private, and you had either a fiduciary duty or a contractual obligation to do that, then there's coverage under the policy to help defend you and settle any of those claims that come in, either on an individual basis or from companies or on a class action basis. The regulatory proceedings is coverage for a government entity that comes into play and says, we need to take a look at things and see what happened here. And the PCI is something that John mentioned before. It's the payment card industry. They have a set of security standards for any POS systems or anybody who's taking payment cards. And they have a certain set of standards that you need to meet. If you haven't met those, they assess some fines and penalties for you. On the next slide,
I jumped over.
Yeah, no problem. No worries. So this is the exciting part. So I know that's why you wanted to jump here. So the next part is the first party coverages, and this is where I think most of our insureds feel that they find the most value. And the first coverage part is really the one that I think everyone feels is kind of the best part of the policy because it provides sort of a built-in incident response plan. As John mentioned before, incident response plans are really critical. They're something that most companies utilize and really need, but they don't necessarily have the tools or the resources available to them to enact those policies once they have them. So this provides coverage for you in the event that you need any sort of legal consultation, if you need a breach coach or someone to really quarterback the whole event for you. Coverage for forensics vendors. Those are vendors that will come in, do an investigation, figure out what it is that happens on your computer system, and then make any changes they need to remediate. The notifications and credit monitoring, if that's something that you need to do, if you have some PII or PHI, personally identifiable information or personal health information, you might be subject to state statutes that dictate that you need to provide some sort of remediation to those people or some sort of notification. And the last part is the public relations and the call center. So that provides just kind of a consistent approach to how you're going to message things. If you're going to issue press releases, because in some states you're able to do that in lieu of individual notifications, they do their best to help you get those out to the news sources and the appropriate news sources to help you with that. The one thing I will mention with this is that it really does provide a cheaper and a better way to respond to a breach. These are working with companies that have negotiated rates, the carriers do. And a lot of times, you know, usually they're so good at what they do that it can keep the cost of the breach down and, you know, potentially the reaction to the breach down as well. The other coverage parts here that we also... Thing. Yes, yep. The other part that I would mention here is the cyber extortion. That's something else that John mentioned before. That's coverage for any sort of ransomware, anything where someone comes in, manipulates or shuts down your system and then demands a ransom for it. It provides some help for you in that event to help you navigate what to do best with that. There's kind of a couple of routes that you can go, either engaging with forensics to help remediate, or potentially you could go ahead and pay the ransom, and a lot of times that is the course that people take, and that is covered by insurance. The business interruption and digital asset protection are two that go hand in hand a little bit as well. The business interruption is similar to what you would find under a property policy, where if you have some sort of loss in revenues because your systems are down, you can't provide the services that you need to because of a breach, because of a third party, or because of just a general failure on your system, then there is coverage under the policy for that, subject to a short waiting period. And the digital asset protection is coverage for the extra expense to go in and remediate any of your lists that you have. If you have extensive client lists, if you have some sort of information that would pertain to corporate confidential information or blueprints, something like that you would have that you'd need to recreate physically, then it would be something that would be coverage for the extra expense that goes along with that. So we can go to the next slide.
Okay.
This one gives, it's pretty to look at, but it gives you just a little bit of an idea of where there's a gap in coverage from your current insurance program. And I won't get into this too much because it does get a little bit technical, but I would encourage you to take a look at the middle box that really talks through the common issues that we have here. And the first is an insured versus insured issue. And what that refers to is the fact that most insurance policies aren't meant to indemnify the person for whom they're insuring. So it's not necessarily meant to say, hey, you've had this incident, you can go ahead and kind of sue yourself under this policy, and then, you know, we'll pay you back for whatever funds you've lost. It's really meant to provide coverage for third parties and the issues that you have with third parties. The other part of it is that there's not coverage for these event expenses that we were just talking about that are so critical to you. It's not anywhere else that you would find in your insurance program. It's really dedicated just to a cyber policy. And more importantly than that, like John mentioned, you know, there's a number of carriers out there that are doing this either on a package policy basis. You know, from our perspective, when we, you know, having expertise in this field, we find that the most effective policies, the best written, and frankly, the best claims experience that we see comes from the carriers that write standalone policies. And you'd be amazed at how cheaply policies can be procured at this point. I mean, the marketplace has been very competitive, and it's something that we find that sometimes these add-ons that other carriers are throwing on can be placed on a policy with a really reputable carrier for a similar cost or a slight increase. We can go to the next one. Some common exclusions on here, and again, I won't get too into the weeds on this because it can get a little bit technical, but the bodily injury and property damage is kind of the main one that is an important exclusion to remember, because as the evolution of technology occurs and exists, we continue to find new ways that this policy can be triggered, and this is one where carriers have really dug in their heels. And there are some policies available that will include this, that kind of merge together a general liability policy, a property policy, and a cyber policy that's very specific to certain industry classes that require that. But you know, someone who experiences a breach and then trips and falls as a result of it is not necessarily something that's going to be covered under the policy. Or if your systems no longer function because of a breach, that's something that would be excluded as well. Reputational damage, I think, is something that we think about a lot when we talk about cyber types of issues. And we really, you know, the reputation is the most important thing that you have. You want people to be well known, and you want to be well known in a very positive light. And, you know, cyber type of breach is something that, you know, here we are 5 years later still talking about Target, or 4.5 years later. And so, it's something that your name can kind of constantly be associated with it. So reputational damage is something that is a little bit less quantifiable. And so it's not something that we typically find as a standard type of coverage on policies. We are seeing a little bit of a loosening up with that, where there can be supplements and there can be some coverage on that. But, traditionally, again, it's a little bit difficult to quantify, so it's not necessarily something that carriers are very excited to throw coverage for. Contractual liability can be a little bit kind of confusing on this, but what it really means is that carriers don't want to see you just agree to anything in a contract if there is a breach. And what they're really concerned about is if you've contractually said that you'll indemnify someone in the event that you have a breach, a third party, and that third party isn't even involved in the breach, and then that company comes back and says, well, you had a breach, and it says that in my contract, then that's not something that they're going to indemnify you for. They understand that your day-to-day operations, confidentiality and those types of things are going to have to be agreed upon in a contract, but it might not agree upon everything that you've said. If it wouldn't have been existing without a written contract, then there's probably not coverage under the policy. We touched a little bit on insured versus insured, and the last one is the violation of consumer protection laws, and that's really the major concern there would be the privacy acts that have been enacted in the last few years, or the last several years. So something like the Telephone Consumer Privacy Act, which is the do not call list. If you've done something and you've invaded that, then there's not necessarily coverage under the policy for that. So that's it. We can open the floor to any questions that you have for John or Matt or I.
Thank you, guys. Suzanne will let you take it from here. Thank you.
This is Suzanne, and I'm going to flip through some of our questions. There are a few in here about the Target incident. Did Fazio have a security system in the computer that clicked on the phishing link? For example, Norton Defense, et cetera. Will a PC security system detect malware on a USB device? I guess that's 2 in 1.
I guess it depends on the protections you have in place and what program, what it does. I mean, it's hard to answer the question. I really don't know what Fazio had in place, but a lot of times, there are programs in place that can identify malware. And they'll warn you about opening an attachment, those kind of things. So there are controls in place, but it really depends on what you have. And it's hard to kind of talk to it because honestly, I don't know what Fazio had. They may have had nothing. They may have had something that wasn't really good. But in any event, this got through. So someone clicked on the link and the malware was then introduced into Fazio's network, which allowed the hackers a gateway into Target. So, that's really a question of how, what kind of protections you have in place, what kind of controls.
Okay, another question that, in Hub's opinion, do you have a recommendation on the best or strongest antivirus, anti-malware software companies or programs can use for protecting personal computers?
Yeah, we don't endorse any commercial product out there right now. I mean, personally, I stick with the name brands, the ones that I'm familiar with that have been around a while. It's a very hard thing to manage because there's a lot of new players entering the market now. They're seeing this is a way to capitalize on it. It's very hard to gauge how good they are. But those that have been in and around a while and the names you recognize, those are the ones I stick with, frankly, because just they have the experience, and these are companies that have been around a long time with lots of resources. So those are the ones I stick with.
Okay. Would you consider WikiLeaks as external intentional?
WikiLeaks. Yeah. Well, I would say that would be. Let me tell you, external intentional is really the hack, right? That's a hacker, someone who's not an employee of the organization. The internal intentional would be someone like Edward Snowden, right? The NSA, hacking the NSA. He was given access. He was a vendor, but he was given access. He was with Booz Allen. And, so external, that's a hack. Internal is an employee that's gone rogue.
Gotcha. Okay. Did Target go after Fazio?
I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if Fazio paid anything, if they're even still in business or they're operating as another company now. But I can tell you, if they did go after them, Target has reported, like I said, almost $300 million. I don't know that Fazio had any insurance. If they did, I guarantee it wasn't anywhere near that. So I don't know, but they very well could have gone after them.
And I would say this is that, look at the loss of income. I'm sure that Target's a nice client for them to have, and they're definitely going to lose that business, but the indirect cost is going to be pretty substantial.
Okay. Do insurance companies do research into a company's procedures? If so, would that not be a good thing for a small company to do? They could take the evaluation and make things more secure.
So you're asking, sorry, Suzanne. So you're asking, do they apply loss control to do an assessment or some type of critical evaluation of the current, like the prospective policyholders? Is that kind of the question?
I'm interpreting this to mean, would an insurance company or an agency or somebody like Hub do an evaluation or do some research of a client or an insured company's internal procedures and provide an evaluation on how they could tighten up their securities?
Right.
Yeah, I guess you can answer it a couple different ways. John, you got the prevention, but I guess, Emily, could you talk about the application process too? I think that's important to know how companies kind of self-report too. So I guess, John, why don't you go first?
Yeah, I mean, as far as, the evaluation, I have probably about 75 questions that I can ask a client about everything from technology to procedures to training to things like that, to get an idea of whether or not they're all yes, no answers. And it gets clients thinking about, okay, I don't train my employees or I don't encrypt my data. I should do that. But that's one thing I kind of can focus on. But in terms of, getting into your network and doing the pen testing, we don't do that kind of detail. That's an outsourced, technology provider that would do the pen testing, really look at the bits and bytes. Mine are more general. But I guess I would turn to Emily to talk about what the application process looks like. So now you have an underwriter from an insurance company that may write coverage for you, but before they do that, they're going to ask a number of questions. Maybe, Emily, you could talk to some of those questions.
Sure, yeah. So the application process is really tailored based on the size of your company. So when it comes to companies that are under, I would say $50 million in revenues or so, the application process is very easy. It's basically putting information about, just very general information about the company, the revenues, and then there's maybe 5 questions or 6 questions about your controls, and then, a couple of questions about whether or not you've ever had an incident. Ask for some details about that incident if you have, and you sign it and send it over to us. So if you're a small company, the expectation is that there are some kind of baseline or base level types of controls that you may or may not have. And that's all that they really want to know about, because they know that the resources aren't there, the manpower, the staffing isn't necessarily there to have the same types of controls that larger companies do. And I think the other part of that as well, I feel like we're picking on Target a lot today, but, you look at Target and Target they were PCI compliant, they did everything right, and they still had a breach. And I think that the longer that cyber insurance is in existence, I think the more that companies are understanding that they don't necessarily need to dig into every bit of minutia when it comes to what their insureds are doing, because sometimes it's just unpredictable. Sometimes you're just not going to know and they're not going to find out. So I think until the advancement of technology slows down a bit, if that ever happens, I think that we're going to continue to see kind of some basic benchmarks that carriers are going to be concerned with and that they're going to rate off of. But ultimately, they don't have a crystal ball, and they're starting to back off a little bit when it comes to the invasive questions.
Okay, I know we're a little over time, but we do have a few more questions. If you don't mind sticking around, we'll continue to run through at least a couple of more.
Sure.
Are there any newer technologies which tend to significantly mitigate the risk of a cyber attack, like end-to-end encryption? From one of our more technical people.
Yeah, there's different levels of encryption. What I would say, VPNs, virtual private networks, are a common way especially when you're out of the office, right? As opposed to using a public Wi-Fi network that might not be secured, you're using your own company's virtual private network, which creates a tunnel, if you will, to transmit data, and that's encrypted. There's a very low chance of you being hacked if you have a VPN versus using a public Wi-Fi, for example. So that's one of the main things I would recommend.
Okay. What is the approximate price point for a cyber policy for an organization with about 60 employees, very rough numbers, or how do you price the cyber policy?
Yeah, so the policy is based off of industry class and revenues. That's really kind of the main rating basis. I would say that minimum premiums traditionally have been around $1,000, but I'm starting to see that dip below the $1,000 mark now for $1 million in coverage. So if you're, I would say, under $20 to $25 million in revenues, you're going to see pretty affordable pricing. It's going to be something that we've gotten an application back, a quote back, and a bind order all on the same day before because it's so cost effective. So, that coupled with kind of the quick submission process, I think that we have found a lot of success with smaller companies deciding to start purchasing the coverage. And to go along with that too, I've spoken to some of our vendors who work with the forensic side of things, and they're saying that they're starting to see more and more what they would consider smaller projects because there are so many buyers. So I would just encourage you to think about it a little bit more seriously because we are starting to see it brought up more often contractually, and we're starting to see more and more smaller sized companies they're feeling like it's a necessary purchase for them. So your peers might be buying it, and if you aren't, you might be a little bit behind.
Okay. There are a few questions that, relate to spoofing and sketchy emails, but do you have a recommendation on that occasionally receive sketchy pop-ups when navigating web browsers on my smartphone? What would be the best way to protect the smartphone from getting hacked or breached?
Yeah. I mean, there's no silver bullet here, but I would just say, update, patch, where you have a patching available. Obviously, there's antivirus programs. We always recommend that. But when it comes to technology, what I've heard it described as basically a race with no finish line. I mean, basically, every time we think we've got it secure, the hackers find a way around it, and then you patch your system, and then you patch it again. I hate to seem sort of evasive here, but there really is no silver bullet. Just do what you can to, stay up to date. You get those updates on your iPhone all the time, software updates. You update when they do, because those are typically patching vulnerabilities. I use the name brand antivirus programs as well. So that's how I do it.
Okay, and then I'm going to go one more. It's a question about those emails that we all tend to get that appear to be from somebody that we know, but it's a weird email, and we should warn them of.
Yeah, I would say, first of all, go ahead, Matt. Yep.
Oh, John, sorry. One tip that I've learned is when you see something that looks familiar but you're not quite sure, like let's say you get a request from Google to, check your passwords, things like that, like in an email. One real common tip we've seen is, you take your mouse and you hover over the name, and it may say like customer service or something, but when you highlight it, it'll show a very strange string of characters that doesn't seem to match. That's a dead giveaway that you've got some type of phishing going on. And John, I'll let you take the rest. Sorry for interrupting you.
Yeah. The other thing too is sometimes they'll send you an email. So your boss is, the CEO is John Smith. It's JOHN.Smith, but it's spelled JON.Smith. Sometimes you might not catch that. So you want to pay attention to every letter. And then even sometimes they infiltrate that CEO's inbox. So it may look like it is his email, and maybe it truly is his email. It's just been controlled by a hacker. If they're asking for sensitive information, W-2 forms or funds transfer, right away, those two, there should be systems in place that you don't automatically do it. You pick up a phone and you call the person requesting those funds transferred or the W-2 forms. It's pretty low tech, but it's very effective. So I would sort of implement those procedures in your organization if, you know, it's over a dollar amount, a certain dollar amount. I mean, maybe it's not going to be every dollar, but over $1,000, right? Have that procedure in place.
All right. Well, I think I'm going to end there. I know that this last side includes contact information for both John and Emily. To me, says that they're willing to answer additional questions regarding cyber risk management, insurability, et cetera. I want to thank Matt, John, and Emily for this very informative and fairly frightening presentation on cybersecurity and processes and procedures we should all contemplate. Matt, do you have any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I do. Suzanne, first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to do this today, and to all the people that stayed in the call. There are some additional tools and resources that are listed at the end of this presentation on the hard copy and the PDF that the association has posted. Also, if there are any additional questions, you know, Suzanne, if you get a bunch more that we didn't cover today, please feel free to forward them to myself, and I will get them answered for you guys and get them back to you. So thanks for your time today.
Okay. Thank you all, and we look forward to seeing you next month. Have a great afternoon and weekend.